Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about voting blocs in the supposedly, or at least once democratic West. If we look at the various groups and blocks of voting, bloc spelled B-L-O-C-S, we notice that the under 21 and under vote overwhelmingly for the Democrat Party. The rebel, the fighting the man, I'm fighting the system, sort of high school, college kid type thing. They vote over, as in, by the way, as I did at that age. Then we look at new demographic developments that didn't really exist in the past, or certainly not to the extent they do today. For example, unmarried women with no children, or single mothers with multiple children from multiple fathers, this sort of thing. They vote overwhelmingly for leftist parties, as do government employees, teachers, for example. Now, some of this has developed fairly recently, these voting blocs, or the circumstances that brought them into existence, maybe is a better way of putting it. So voting for 18-year-olds is fairly recent. So we're talking a development that was across the Western world, sort of occurred between the late 1960s and mid-1970s. And this was related to conscription for to a large extent, at least, conscription into the armed services, or being sent to military duty, say, in Vietnam. So that was something that Australia was affected by. So leftist governments took a position against this and against the use of nuclear weapons, things like that, which had a lot of appeal for the leftist crowd and the Marxist crowd generally, that was very, very generously spread, infected with Soviet Marxist agitators and activists that were encouraging this pacifist view, in as much as that it would then reduce the threat to the Soviet Union. So the 18-year-olds getting the vote is a fairly new thing, and it was a trade-off. It was an exchange. It was an example of how power was shared in those days, but how it is no longer. How power was shared. Okay, you're going to go out into the front lines and get shot at and get killed. And the vote at that stage was 21, or even in some places 23. The vote was age 21, but you could be called up to be put in the front line and die at 18. It was only reasonable at 18-year-olds, given that, was get the vote. Now, if you like, the power establishment thought that was a worthwhile trade-off, because in those days it was imagined that mass call-up of soldiers, boots on the ground type call-up, was going to be during the Cold War period. And of course, Vietnam, as I mentioned a moment ago, this was how it was going to be. There was going to be a war at any time. There'd be mass call-ups, so the people should be given, the younger people who would serve on the front lines should be given the vote, and it was a decent exchange of power. We'll let you have the vote, provided you agree to go and die for us, was the deal, if you like. That's a crass way of expressing it, but nonetheless. Now, but then the situation changed. The idea of massed warfare and massed boots on the ground started to give way over time to more technological warfare, and today we see cyber warfare and drones and things like that. So and a much greater emphasis on materiel and technology, and a much less emphasis, not that I think it's gone away to the extent the elites think it might have, but a much lesser reliance on boots on the ground. And there's no real need to occupy another country in the old military sense of marching down the main street with your soldiers and so on. You can, it's possible to control a country through threats of, not a third world country like Afghanistan that has no modern infrastructure, but any country that has a modern infrastructure, then it's much easier to control them by threat of, cyber, cutting off all their water and power and disrupting everything that their communication systems, everything is sort of on lockdown, and this is, you can control them. An advanced society, you know, they can be controlled in this way without need for boots on the ground, or certainly not large numbers of them. And we saw this to even Iraq, which was hardly a super advanced country, but it's advanced enough where really a military force of about 100,000, give or take, could go in and occupy the place. And you know, those sort of numbers relative to what used to be the case years ago, those are quite small numbers. So anyway, the relationship with boots on the ground and the need for boots on the ground had changed. But at that stage, the vote had already been given away, and it's a bit hard to reverse. We don't need you to go on the front lines and die anymore, so we'll take the vote away from you, you silly young punks. But it created a voting group that will overwhelmingly vote left and is very susceptible to the leftist type propaganda, equality and egalitarianism, and you know, life's pretty scary getting out there and competing for jobs and trying to get by, and so it's a pretty scary thought. But we'll get rid of all that for you. We'll have a society with equal outcomes. Oh yeah, that sounds good. Particularly given as well something that occurred sort of around that Vietnam period and onward, was that there was a very small number of women in college. And that now the numbers of women have exploded. More importantly, the sort of courses that women gravitate towards, you know, the sociology, cultural studies, gender studies, lesbian dance theory, all that sort of stuff, means there's a much larger tranche of radicalized student type women who have been radicalized to believe that, you know, heterosexuality is evil and the family unit's evil and so on, who as they move through the education system, this radicalization system, because it's not education, I mean a degree in cultural studies, you know, a degree in peace studies, what the fuck's that? So these people have been radicalized to be very anti-family, and they now are quite a large voting bloc. So you've got a few sort of things moving along here. One is the votes being given to young people under the age of 21. And this was, again, a deal in exchange for you're going to put your life on the line. But they're not really required to put their life on the line anymore, and may never be, given the advances in technological type warfare. So that trade-off, that exchange, has ended up being a one-sided exchange. They were given the vote in return for agreeing to die. Now they don't have to die anymore, but they still have the vote, and that hasn't been withdrawn. The other thing is was bringing women into the workforce and through the education system, radicalizing women through the cultural studies, the gender studies, the sociology, and so on, which has been hysterically radicalized. And that in turn has created a large voting bloc of unmarried, you know, the cat ladies, as they call it, unmarried women who are going to, again, primarily vote for daddy being the state. And so if you combine the two voting blocks of the under 21s, the increasing number, again, these weren't foreseen when the vote was given to everybody. These weren't foreseen when the women were being brought into the workforce and through the education. None of these crystallizing factors, if you will, existed at that time. They've come along since, and those crystallizing factors were taken advantage of new circumstances to create, in some cases inadvertently, but create nonetheless new voting blocks. Now, if you look at the numbers of under 21s who vote in pretty much any Western election, and we'll use the US one as an example, if you took out the amount of under 21s that vote Democrat, the Democrats would really struggle to win any elections. I mean, they'd win some, but gee, not very many. And if you look then also at the radicalization of the single women cat lady with their lesbian dance theory degrees, then you look at that voting bloc again. If you took that voting bloc out, the Democrats would really struggle to win. So, or the leftists, the pro-globalists would struggle to win. Now, that probably doesn't mean much because the globalists have penetrated and undermined, subverted all the major political parties in the West. So that's probably not relevant in itself. But if you look at, nonetheless, the voting blocs, they've assisted, or materially, they've been very much responsible for the subversion of our democracy that's been subverted from within. So you can still maintain that the trappings of a so-called democracy, having elections, people going to the ballot box, casting their vote and this sort of thing, and you can still subvert democracy quite comprehensively, which I would argue has happened. Now, if you look at some of the great statesmen, if you like, of the last 100 years or so, 100 years plus, even going back as far as ancient Greece, the likes of Aristotle and Plato and those sort of people, that they've really, the minds of some of the greatest thinkers of all time have been seriously tested by thinking who should get the vote and why, what is the purpose of democracy, what safeguards can be put in place to prevent the democratic process from being subverted or turning into some sort of a tyranny and so on. And that's a question or a series of questions that hasn't been fully answered or solved, or has any formula been developed that could guard against the subversion of democracy. If you look at the American one, the founding fathers, as they're called in the American system, they tried to put in James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and these were people who were certainly beating their brains out back in the day trying to come up with a system of checks and balances so that they couldn't be subverted. Bear in mind, they were thinking pretty much of how can we stop a monarchy being developed and power centralizing around the monarchy. They heavily, I think, overestimated the power of the monarch in England. Already the power sharing was substantial, and Parliament was already sovereign over the king. Sure, the king had a lot of influence. Sure, there was an iconic place in the society, but the reality is, when push came to shove, it was Parliament that had the power. The king the monarch having peripheral power, but not decisive power, influential power, but not the power to really veto things. Now the American sort of formulators of the Constitution and the attendant issues like the Bill of Rights, those sorts of things, they very much had their eye on monarchy and over centralization of power. And I think they over-assessed and thought that the monarchy in Britain had more power than it actually did. And it was the propaganda of we're fighting King George, and that, I think, allowed them to get a little bit carried away with how they perceived power, how they perceived its uses, its applications, and how it was derived. And so they were combating, to some extent, a phantom that didn't exist or didn't exist as big as they thought it did. Nonetheless, the American Constitution was probably one of the better efforts ever made in human history about putting in checks and balances. And yet we look at today and it's still being subverted. Well, whether you say through rigged elections, which are supposedly illegal, but then there's a whole legal system that failed to act on it. There's a whole political system that really didn't go chasing after it. So there's the subversion of the political system, the voting system, for goodness sakes, today is happening at multiple levels. The meaningless voting, the subversion of all the major political parties, rigging of votes, rigging elections if they don't like an outcome, and so on. So there's a lot of things going on there. But what do you do to bring integrity and some sort of sanctity back to the election and the voting system? Who should have the vote? Now, certainly the people that I talk, the ones who fancy themselves as the elite, they believe that the great unwashed, which is more or less their definition, anyone that doesn't have a lesbian dance degree, the great unwashed, people with no college degree, university degree, they shouldn't have the right to vote. And their vote shouldn't mean anything. They shouldn't be allowed to vote. Or their views, their opinions, their concerns are irrelevant and should be dismissed. They're the plebeians, they're the hoi polloi, they're the great unwashed. Now, this fits in quite nicely with how modern democracy, as in universal franchise and universal suffrage, particularly to the younger people, 18 years old, how this developed. It was a deal that was cut to power share during times of war. So World War One, World War Two, the trying to pacify the people that were angry during the Great Depression, all these sorts of things combined to say, well, we'll share power with you in order to pacify you, in order to ensure that you'll go and die for us when we call upon you to do so. Mass conscription, mass industrial warfare, such as World War One and World War Two was. But that was a deal specific to times and circumstances. They didn't want to give the vote to the working class. They didn't want to give the vote to the younger people. They only did as a trade-off in the time. So should we then revisit? So you don't have to die anymore for us. So we're changing the vote to 21. And by the way, we only want to give the vote to married people with children, and so on. Now, this is great statesmen, and I mentioned people here such as Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. Whatever you may or may not think about the guy, he certainly did think about how can we create a voting system where people are really concerned for effective, efficient government, concerned for a better future, these sorts of things. And I'm not suggesting that all his thoughts were perfect or that he considered every angle. I don't believe he had, but that's pretty much on the right track. Now, if we look at democracy, say in Britain in the 1880s, it had reached probably its high point in terms of those that have the biggest stake in society should have the biggest say, that is the vote. So the majority of, not all, but the majority of men and about 10% of women, all of whom were married or had inherited a lot of money, that sort of thing, that they should be the people that decided the government and the future. But this was before mass industrial warfare, such as World War One or World War Two. So that was the high point of society as it was then structured. But as mass industrial war came along, further trade-offs were needed. Now, what is the power elite? The globalists and their leftist foot soldiers. Those angry lesbians waving LGBTQ placards in the street. All they are is the foot soldiers of the globalists. Nothing more than that. The expendable foot soldiers who will be turned over and thrown under the bus the second they're not needed anymore. But the same could be said for the vote. We only gave you the vote, the power elites, sort of I'm paraphrasing the attitudes here. We only gave you the vote because we wanted you to die for us. We don't need that from you anymore. So we can't take the vote away from you, so we'll just subvert it. And if you look at the talk, talking to, say, government employees, particularly the better paid public servants who've got a job for life, their primary attitude and view is that these people shouldn't have the vote. The people who vote for Donald Trump, they're just those working class white people, white working class men. That's what they are. White working class women, like, oh, well, yeah. But if it's white working class men, they should be not allowed to have the vote. And if they do have the vote, it must be in some way neutralized. So when you talk to people, and I'll do another video on this specific point, but when you talk to people, say, is it okay to rig elections? Well, yeah, if you don't like the person, it is, because Trump's getting voted for, all those white working class men, and they shouldn't have the vote anyway. So if we rig the vote to stop Trump winning, then we're actually doing a good thing. I mean, that's insane, for fuck's sake. But so how do we restore not only confidence and integrity in the voting system, but also have people who are voting for the real issues? Now, I'll just jump another. If you look at, say, voting and the various major parties, political parties in say in the entire post-World War II period, there were policy prescriptions that were quite different. They both wanted the best for the people. They both wanted to improve standards of living. They both wanted to improve the lives of the citizens in the country that they were in, the political parties were in. They all seemed to want that, with the exception of the Banana Republic type places, but certainly the Western democracies. And they all agreed on the outcome, more or less, the outcome they wanted, improving the lives of the citizens. But they had different prescriptions and different methodologies getting there. There were the leftist parties that thought more in terms of collectivism and more of the socialist type policies, still capitalist, but more heavier taxes, more social programs, that sort of thing. And then the more capitalist-leaning parties that weren't so heavily invested in the socialism and the social programs, but were keener to develop commerce as it was a way of increasing the tax take, but without having to engage in major redistribution of income and wealth and opportunities. But again, they were heading both in the same direction. Now, the policies today, if you look at the major parties in the West, and Trump is an exception to this, but and he's a one-off and a rare exception, and only in America really could that have happened through the primaries selection process. But the political parties in the West today, if you can tell the difference between their policies, I mean, you look at, say, the Conservative and the Labor Party in Britain. I mean, what is the difference? I mean, is there much? Both are into mass migration. Both are into the Green New Deal. Both are into LGBTQ. Both are into trashing British history and British culture and so on. So there's no difference between them there. Now, Trump is the exception, though, and this is where democracy has its place. Now, I strongly, firmly believe, and it's almost beyond question, that in the 2020 election, the globalist cabal whistled up about 20 million votes for Biden. Here's a guy who could barely string a sentence together and who didn't campaign at all, and yet somehow he gets the highest number of votes in the history of US presidential elections. I mean, I don't buy it for a second, by the way. And given the very questionable number of votes where, the mail-in ballots, where there was no signature matching and so on, the broken chain of custody and votes moving between counting and voting booths and collation centres and so on, that there was approximately 20 million votes they invented into existence. Now, but if we look at today, Trump actually has policies, and you look at the policies of the Democrats, the globalist party, and you look at Trump and his policies, and the Republicans are lukewarm behind him because most of them are globalist controlled, most of the Republican Party. But Trump's platform of improving the lives of American citizens, bringing American jobs back to America, reducing the cost, getting rid of the silly Green New Deal and reducing the cost of energy, reducing the cost of rent and mortgages, expelling the illegal aliens, stopping the mass migration and the illegal migration, all these sort of things will have a fairly quick and very measurable improvement in the standard of living of America. Now, the globalists will fight tooth and nail to stop him, but and they'll do every trick in the book, whether it be rigging elections, stacking juries, bringing false charges, manufacturing charges, assassination attempts. They'll do the lot. But nonetheless, if Trump's able to even pull off part of his program, it'll have a huge positive effect on the lives of American citizens, which, as the President of the United States, he's obligated to do, by the way. But this brings us back again to voting. Should the voting system get a huge shake-up? Should the voting be, anyone under the age of 23 can't vote unless, again, they're serving in the armed forces or in some sort of frontline thing like, firefighters rushing into the burning building, these sorts of things. People that sacrifice, put their lives on the line, I think, should have a say in the government. But that aside, should only married people with children, for example, have the right to vote, and so on. So these are the questions, and I think we're going to have to deal with them one way or another, whether we like it or not, because the dysfunction that is now built into the voting system through who has the right to vote and so on is destroying us from within. And if it isn't revisited and integrity and balance restored to it, then it's going to continue to wither away, and that dictatorships and tyrannies will just be everywhere. You've been with us today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.